Middle East diplomatic moves are off the front pages. They appear, in fact, to be off the radar screen almost completely. That's strange in a way when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict stands poised at a critical crossroad. One doesn't want to overstate the drama of the moment, and by moment I don't mean that literally moment. I mean the coming few weeks or couple of months at the outset. But this could be as critical a moment as June 1967 for the Middle East, when during the Six-Day War Israel came to occupy large swathes of territory beyond the state's 1948 boundaries. The question at the crossroads is this: is there going to be a fresh bout of negotiations which aims at bringing peace and ending the 100-year conflict? Or is Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert going to have the chance to implement what he says is the top priority issue on his agenda, to take Israel down a unilateral road towards fixing its readjusted borders in the West Bank, after carrying out a major upheaval of settlements and a second major withdrawal following that in Gaza last summer, this time in the West Bank? In concrete terms, what's on the table right now is an elaborate diplomatic chess game. The next move belongs very much to the Palestinians. But the man who sparked the game off was Ehud Olmert, and even more so, President George W. Bush. Against expectations, and by all accounts against the advice of his so-called experts in the State Department, the President gave the Israeli leader what he was looking for in Washington last week: conditional support for his vaunted realignment program in the West Bank. But first, before Israel goes ahead with any move unilaterally, said the President, the Palestinians must be allowed the opportunity to convince that they are a viable negotiating partner. A negotiated agreement is much better, reasoned the President. Indeed, he made plain, it's the only way to proceed towards a full-scale peace. Olmert took up the challenge and threw out a challenge of his own to the Palestinian leadership. Come and meet with us to negotiate peace was his challenge from the podium of the US Congress. Anything but overawed, in stepped Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. Shrugging off the way Israel dismisses him as weak, and American fears that he is indeed weak, Abu Mazen deftly picked up the Olmert challenge by throwing down a challenge of his own to the hitherto recalcitrant Hamas leadership, now the Palestinian government. If Hamas does not agree within 10 days to accept a position which implicitly includes recognition of Israel and lining up with a coordinated Palestinian position for two states to live side by side along the 1967 borders, not for Palestine to replace Israel, then he, Abu Mazen, would call a referendum of the Palestinian people to get their support for him to negotiate alone from such a standpoint. Hamas was caught off guard. It was a challenge that was difficult for them to accept, but equally difficult for them to reject. Saying yes would betray their firm nay principles with regard to Israel. Saying no, on the other hand, would be to go against the majority of the Palestinian people's opinion, which generally supports the idea of a Palestinian state on the 1967 lines alongside Israel. Thus far, Hamas has balked, refused to budge. The 10-day deadline set by Abu Mazen may indeed slip a little, but this remains a key moment for the Palestinians to consolidate their strategy or not. One way or another, they shall have to resolve their internal rift. Olmert, meanwhile, is not just waiting. On Sunday, he meets with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in a two-way summit in the Sinai resort of Sharm el-Sheikh, in preparation, we've been told, for a three-way summit that will include Abu Mazen, the Palestinian president, as well. But if the Hamas moment of truth is very much upon it, then Ehud Olmert's moment of truth may not be far behind. If the Palestinians do step forward and create the effect that they are a serious partner for talks, something which it has to be admitted seems at this stage most unlikely, then the Israeli leader would indeed have to engage their negotiating process. But if they do not, then his next move would need to be to engage his own disengagement policy very seriously, to begin to transform what Mr. Bush called bold ideas into a well-constructed plan of action. That will require serious moves domestically to line up sufficient support for a move which in some ways would be even more dramatic than the Oslo Peace Accords, which, it should be recalled, never resulted in Israel leaving any of the territories whatsoever which it had occupied in 1967. On his first trip to Washington, Olmert proved himself the first Israeli prime minister who had come out saying clearly that Israel no longer wants most of the West Bank and indeed regards it not as an asset to Israel, but a burden. Israel, wrote the prestigious Tel Aviv daily Haaretz in an editorial this week, Israel, said the paper, must begin its realignment towards the 1967 border, the sooner the better. It must do so, said the paper, not because the Americans agree and not because there is no partner on the Palestinian side for withdrawal by agreement, but because Israel has a clear and immediate interest in reducing the occupation and Israeli control over Palestinian lives, as well as in creating preconditions for the establishment of a Palestinian state free of an Israeli presence altogether. Thus Haaretz. But more than that, the essence of the realignment plan, or convergence as it's better known, is about Israel finally deciding to do what it deems best for Israel, to turn in on itself and to tackle the seams within its own society rather than to be forever preoccupied with the seam between Israel and the Palestinians. After all, wasn't it Ehud Olmert himself who nearly 3 years ago now actually preceded Ariel Sharon in declaring that the time has come for Israelis to do something which they have put off since 1967, to make critical decisions about what kind of Israel it is that they want, both in terms of physical boundaries, but even more importantly, in terms of the nature of their state and the society that makes up their state. Soon Olmert will need to put that challenge to the Israeli people in the most practical of ways. That, in the final analysis, is why this is so critical a crossroad.